Hello everybody, my name is Adrian Whiteman and I'm the head of IRENA Statistics, and today I'll be making a short presentation about the off-grid energy data collection we've been doing in IRENA in the last few years, and talking a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned from this exercise. I'll start first by talking a little bit about the background and the objectives for this work, why we did it, what we hope to get out of it. I'll talk about the various data sources that we use. The main part of the presentation will be me explaining how we measure a lot of the data and how we have to convert the raw data into standard energy units, including the estimations and assumptions that we sometimes have to make to do this. I'll then talk briefly about data management and processing, or some of the very basic statistical practices that we follow to ensure the validity and consistency of the data. I'll present a few results and then present a slide on the lessons that we've learned. So, why did we decide to start collecting this information? Well, there are many reports that suggest that off-grid electricity supply serves many people, and it's also expected to grow rapidly because large numbers of people live in remote areas that are unlikely to be served by the grid anytime soon. From these reports, we know that a lot of data does exist, and also in our regular data collection we see sites, websites, projects, databases that mention off-grid information, but this data is very scattered across many different places, and it's not systematically measured by countries, and it's certainly not systematically measured at the global level. So we thought that we would attempt to compile it all at the global level and standardize it. There are, of course, a number of challenges with collecting off-grid data. Much of the electricity produced off-grid is produced by what we call auto-producers, and these are individuals and enterprises that are not traditionally part of the energy sector. Their main activities are not energy production, they are producing it for their own consumption, and this includes households and, for example, public services such as rural clinics, schools, telecoms operators and the like. And it's also quite a challenge because there are very large numbers of small plants. We have mini grids that can be quite large, but an awful lot of off-grid supply is at the level of a few individual solar panels on the roof of a building somewhere, or even at a much smaller scale, home systems and lamps and lighting kits that are very large in number, but very small in terms of individual capacities. The scope of our data collection is that we look for off-grid solar, hydro and biogas production in developing countries. We only look at biogas in China. We don't look at the other types of electricity production because China has very good data on that already. And for biogas, we also collect information about the use of biogas for heat as well as electricity production. The purpose of it was to expand and refine our data for off-grid plants, to find out where off-grid production may be occurring but not reported, and to separate the on and off-grid production in our database. As I mentioned before, it's also to check the validity of the off-grid estimates that we make from trade data. We also wanted to see if there's a way of standardizing measurements so that they fit with the international standards for energy statistics, and also to see if there's reasonable ways of making estimations to fill gaps where the data may not be quite formatted as it needs to be. We also wanted to identify end users because it's fine knowing that there's solar panels in a country and that there's probably generation, but it's also useful to know what that's used for. We can do this, for example, to examine linkages to the other SDGs. And finally, what we also do in this exercise is we try to measure or estimate the numbers of beneficiaries or the numbers of people that are gaining electricity access from this off-grid supply, which is something outside the normal boundaries of energy statistics, which tend to focus mostly on capacity and production in kilowatts, kilowatt hours and megajoules. We collect data basically at the level of individual plants or groups of plants or sales of solar panels and devices. We have multiple data sources that we use. Some countries do have national databases or statistics in their energy reports about off-grid projects, so we have that to start with. We have international trade data, not just on solar panels, but there is some international trade data also on solar devices such as lights and solar home systems. We have, of course, the Gogla data as well on the sales for their members. And then there's a vast number of pieces of information out there in projects and from suppliers in their websites, or we contact them by emails and ask them what they've been installing in countries, and we've got a lot of information through that procedure. We collect 4 basic pieces of information about each observation. This is true of any kind of statistics. Where there is a number, there is usually information about the country, the year, the product, and the flow. So country and year is fairly obvious. In terms of products, we have the technologies, the types of renewables. Basically, it's electricity from either hydro, biogas, or solar PV, and solar PV is produced in many different ways. And then there's the production of biogas in biogas digesters. And in terms of the flows, we have 3 or 4 main flows that we collect in each observation. Data about the capacity of the plants, the production of the plants, and the consumption or the end use of that energy. And then in the cases where the production supplies people, supplies households, residences, there's the number of beneficiaries, number of people gaining access through that, and the level of access that they receive. And I'll explain that a little bit later on. The challenge we have with a lot of the raw data is that it is very simply measured in number of units often. And we have to convert this to standard units of flow, as I said before, either capacity, production, or number of beneficiaries. So if we think about the different technologies, we have, for example, biogas digesters. There are many places you can get information about the number of biogas digesters that have been built and installed in a year. Usually there's information about the average digester size, or if they come in a range of sizes, some information about what they are, and typically the distribution of installations by those sizes, so we can get an average. If we multiply those two together, we end up with the total biogas digester capacity installed in that country or in that project in cubic meters, and that is the kind of information that we want for energy statistics. From that, then, it's also important to have the annual production of the biogas. This is often not reported, but there are some fairly standard conversion factors that are used throughout the biogas sector, and we use those. And we can also convert cubic meters of production into megajoules. Basically, 1 cubic meter of biogas is usually about 65% methane, and therefore about 22 megajoules per cubic meter. For electricity, we have a similar approach. There's information on numbers of units, the unit size in watts. If it's solar lamps, this is typically very small, larger numbers of units, but very small sizes. If it's a mini grid, we may have a record that is 1 unit and the unit size is several kilowatts or even possibly megawatts. Anyway, multiplying the number of units by the unit size, we get the total capacity installed in a place in a year. And then again, we have to try to estimate the annual generation. This is often not recorded, but again, there are some fairly standard tools that can be used to estimate this, usually based around some kind of capacity utilization factor. So taking the capacity, multiplying it by 8,760, which is the number of hours in a year, and then multiplying it by the utilization factor, or the percentage of the time that it's operating, we can end up with an estimate of annual generation. In terms of numbers of beneficiaries, most of these data sources will talk about the number of households or the number of people that are receiving electricity from these projects. We record both of those pieces of data, but there is a need to check whether there are real numbers of connections, because it's quite common for mini-grid developers, for example, to talk about installing a mini-grid in a village of so many households, but the actual number of connections is much less than the number of households in the village. And then also for the number of beneficiaries, we look at the electricity access tiers, which is a common way of measuring the quality of the electricity supply. And this is largely based on the annual supply per household, which we calculate from the data that we have collected. As I said, we usually have biogas capacity, average unit size and number of units, so that's quite easy, but we rarely have biogas production data because this is usually not measured. But there are some fairly standard ways of estimating production. So for example, for floating drums or dome digesters, the daily production is usually calculated as the capacity of the digesters divided by 3. And for bag digesters, it's usually capacity divided by 4. That's at the small scale. Industrial scale digesters are very different because their daily gas production can be highly variable depending on the feedstocks and the way that they're managed. However, most industrial scale digesters are used to produce electricity, and we have the good piece of information that 1 cubic meter of biogas typically generates 2 kilowatt hours of electricity. So if we don't know the biogas production, we can often estimate that from the electricity generation if it's known, or sometimes we have to do the opposite. Or if not, we can estimating it using a generator capacity utilization, which is usually about 40 to 50%. And then we can check the numbers to see if they make sense. So for example, you'll see at the bottom there a very large covered lagoon, which was in a presentation from Vietnam, talking about typical biogas digesters and livestock units there. It's about 20,000 cubic meters. And they said that it comes with a 300 kilowatt generator usually, so we have the 2 capacity numbers, but we don't have any information on production. So if we assume 50% capacity, then basically the generator is generating 300 times 24 times 0.5, or 3,600 kilowatt hours a day, and that would require about 1,800 cubic meters a day of biogas, with the 1 meter of biogas generating 2 kilowatt hours. If we then look at that, that's about 9% of the digester capacity, which is within the range of values we'd expect to see for an industrial scale bag digester. These things do not generate as much gas as the small scale bag digesters for a number of technical reasons. If it was something like a stirred tank, as is shown in the picture above, then the opposite would be true. We would generally expect to see daily gas production of a much higher percentage of the digester capacity. So by performing these kinds of calculations, we can validate our numbers to make sure that they're internally consistent, even though they are largely estimates. For small-scale solar devices, we are fortunate that Gogler collects a lot of information on this and has quite detailed information in terms of numbers of units sold in different countries and the size of those units. If we don't have that sort of information, we can often get this, if it's not presented by a project, we can get this from descriptions of the devices that are being used or the end users. Typically there are a number of different scales. Portable lights with cells attached to the top are generally less than 1 watt in size, because that's the largest size of solar cell you can typically fit on the top of a light. Sometimes the portable lights come with detachable panels, generally in the range of 1 to 3 watts, although the one shown here is actually 3.4 watts. Lighting kits are a little larger, 3 to 11 watts, the two shown here. The one on the left is a 10-watt solar panel and the one on the right is a 5-watt solar panel. These have a battery pack and a number of lights attached to them. And then home systems are basically even larger versions of this with larger panels, lights and more sockets for other devices to be plugged into the battery pack to provide more functionality. In countries where we know Gogla have got records of sales in a year, we would not typically add any other information to that country in that year to avoid double counting, because many projects that provide this type of equipment are actually providing equipment that comes from Gogla members and is already recorded in their data. For other types of off-grid, we quite often do have information about the capacity, mini-grids and the likes, and sometimes solar panels on pumps and other pieces of equipment. If not, we quite often have to look at pictures of the projects and count the cells or the panels, or we have some general rules of thumb based on the data that we have about the typical sizes of these installations. So solar water pumps, for example, are often, the irrigation, they're in the range of about 2 to 4 kilowatts. The one shown is actually not for irrigation, it's for providing water for livestock. And if you count the cells, it's basically 9 times 4 cells times 5 watts per cell and 4 panels, so that's 720 watts. Communication masts, the size of those, the capacity of those depends on how many base stations there are on the mast or how many mobile operators are using it. 1 to 2 kilowatts per base station, and there's usually 1, 2 or 3 base stations on a communication mast. Again, looking at the picture here, these are small panels, 180 watt panels, there's 24 of them, so that's about 4.3 kilowatts. Solar street lights, generally in the range of 100 to 2 watts for minor roads, twice that for major roads, or in this case it's a motorway in China, and again it's quite easy to tell the scale of the capacity because there's 2 full-size panels, that's 12 by 6 cells, 360 watts in total, so that's 720 watts with 2 panels. A lot of information about solar street lighting projects is actually given in terms of the power wattage of the lights that have been installed, but it's important to note that the solar panel capacity is 3 to 4 times the rating of the light bulbs used. So a 50 watt LED solar street light will typically have a 150 watt or a 200 watt panel providing the electricity. When it comes to estimating generation, once we've got all the capacity data for these devices and these panels, we generally use the Global Solar Atlas default values for the capital cities in each country. So here, for example, is the value for Accra, which shows that 1 kilowatt of panels should generate 1,509 kilowatt hours per year. For the hydropower generation, this is very difficult to estimate. It's often not provided, so we will typically use the capacity utilization factor from on-grid hydro in the country, or sometimes we will look at the numbers of people that are connected to the hydro and try to work back from this what the likely consumption of electricity is, and therefore the generation, because off-grid hydro is sometimes produces different levels of electricity compared to on-grid hydro. I've talked mostly so far about how we standardize the measurements into kilowatts, kilowatt hours, cubic meters. We have that then for each plant, each record, each observation. When we come to build a time series, we have to take into account how this should be aggregated over time. And what's important to note is that these devices do not last forever, so we can only count things for a certain number of years. In the case of small-scale biogas, we have decay functions that assume that every 5 years A proportion of them are being used and another proportion are no longer being used. In many cases, we do have information from monitoring studies that give us, at least the first 2 5-year periods, some idea of the decline in use of these plants. Sometimes they break, or sometimes people just go and use other sources of energy. For large-scale biogas, we assume that they are continuing to operate unless we find other information. And this is typically the case because they are either generating electricity and they want to sell this, or they have to do the biogas plant as some kind of water treatment. Solar lights and lighting kits, we assume that these sales in a year, from the sales in a year, that the devices last for 3 years. So we only count the last year, 3 years sales in a country. And for home systems, we count the last 5 years. And we assume that about 3% of what is sold is lost due to breakage. And for calculating numbers of beneficiaries, we also estimate that about 10% of the sales are repeat sales to people that already have these devices, so we don't count them as additional beneficiaries. These numbers were estimated in consultation with Gogler. There are some places where we know solar home systems are managed and provided by utilities or governments, and they are maintained, so we assume that they are still operating. And for other types of solar panels and hydro, we assume they are still operating. This is something we'll have to look at in the future, because we are starting to get to the point at which solar panels will be wearing out and needing replacing. They typically should last about 20 to 25 years. Before long, this is something we're going to have to address in the database. For the number of beneficiaries, we record both the number of households and the number of people getting electricity supply in the database. We usually only have one of those figures in the raw data, and then we estimate the other one based on the average rural household size or the national household size, if that's not available. For mini-grids, as I said earlier, we have to do a lot of validity checks to make sure that the numbers quoted in projects really represent the likely number of connections. It's quite common, as I said, to see, for example, a 2 kilowatt mini-grid being provided to a village with 800 households in it. And when you look at the 800 divided by 2 kilowatts, the level of supply is obviously so small that there's not 800 households connected to it. So when we see this sort of information, we try to look at connection figures from other plants in the country, other mini-grids, or we assume a supply of roughly 5 to 10 households per kilowatt of installed capacity in the mini-grid. That's based on the general kinds of numbers that we see in this data. The level of electricity access is based on the household supply. Tier 1 is 4.5 kilowatt hours per household per year, and Tier 2 is 73. Basically, most lights and lighting kits do not reach the level of Tier 1. The larger lighting kits may, but generally they don't. Small solar home systems will meet Tier 1, and the larger solar home systems will meet the Tier 2 level of access. In terms of data management, our main data table has 22 fields that are all defined and have controls in terms of the type of information that can go into them. We have 8 fields that give basically the year, the location or the country, and the product, have that recorded in them. We then have another 8 fields with most of the numeric information in it, and this is the values for capacity, production, numbers of beneficiaries, tiers, and the end use. And then we have another 6 fields for other various notes that go with the records. For the product classification, we have 3 separate files for solar PV, hydro and biogas, so that's the main types of renewables. And then the solar PV is also divided into technology types, basically because the aggregation and conversion into time series is different in terms of the numbers of years of sales or installations that we will count when we aggregate the data. So we have separate tables for solar lights, home systems, mini-grids, pumps and other types of PV installations. We collect the data throughout the year from various websites that we see, some national databases we know when they're updated, and we have the daily IRENA media briefs which contain a lot of information about projects. And then we compile it and validate it, check it and standardize the data and publish it at the end of the year. We are a little bit late this year and currently working on the data for last year at the moment. We take the plant data and we convert it into annual additions, so the amount of expansion of capacity and production each year, and that's the gross values, and then we produce final tables from this by taking into account our assumptions about decommissioning. When we have this data, we don't put that immediately into the IRENA statistics. What we do is we add it as a supplementary sheet to the IRENA questionnaires, so that we can validate the estimates that we have in those questionnaires or the data that we're getting from countries, or we can talk to the countries about the off-grid data that they have and some of these other pieces of information that we found so that we can then put it in the database. This is just an overview of the number of plants that we have in the database. As you could see, for biogas digesters, solar lights and home systems, it's in the tens of millions, although the number of records we have is much smaller because each record will typically represent a number of sales of these devices or a number of installations of biogas digesters in one place in 1 year. For the other types of solar, generally it's in the tens of thousands of plants that we have in the database, and again a smaller number of records. Some of these things, such as mini grids, we have one record for one plant, but there are also examples of projects, for example, that have installed tens or hundreds of mini grids in locations, and we will have one record for all of those plants in a country and a year. I won't spend too long actually presenting results in terms of what we've found in terms of numbers, because this is published in our statistics anyway. But some interesting things, for example, biogas production in Africa is not really reported by anybody other than us, and in this database we found that around 400,000 people in Africa, probably higher than that now, are using biogas for cooking, and generation is about 45 million cubic meters. This is currently not reported in the energy statistics of most international agencies, but we do have this in our off-grid database and our off-grid publication. This slide shows numbers of people that are deriving energy access from the different technologies in recent years. As you can see, up to 2016 it was about 150 million people. The majority is basically solar lights and solar lighting kits. That's about 150 million, and the rest is some kind of mini grids or solar home systems that are providing higher levels of energy access. And as you can see, like many things in renewables, this number is growing very rapidly, although I think it's slowed down. The growth has slowed down in recent years. And just to briefly show how this information can be used to get a richer picture of the use of off-grid electricity, we have, for example, information about the use of solar PV panels in rural clinics and the number of those that's increasing. We've got now a little over 20,000 solar plants on the roofs of rural clinics recorded in the database. In terms of commercial uses, a huge amount of the capacity that's installed is actually for phone towers, and then for other uses we have schools, health centres, public water supply and street lighting. And basically it's quite common now, we're seeing in types of projects that are coming in health and education and street lighting, off-grid solar is becoming the energy source of choice for many of these types of projects. In terms of the lessons learned, the data that we've collected has confirmed our suspicions that there is a considerable amount of data out there, and it can be used, but the data needs to be reported in better units, and particularly to go beyond just reporting the number of plants that have been installed in a country in a year or by a project. To do this, it would be good for people reporting this data to follow a basic level of good statistical practice, to follow normal definitions in terms of what the products are, to classify the types of devices being used, and to report measurement units in standard energy units such as kilowatts or cubic meters or megajoules, so that it can be used in energy statistics. Reporting number of beneficiaries needs improving. As I said, there's a big incentive to maybe exaggerate a little the amount of energy access that's being provided by talking about mini grids in villages and then quoting the whole population of the village. We do a lot of checking to try to correct for this, but this needs to be improved. I think it's also possible to think about other performance indicators in terms of numbers of people benefiting from renewable energy being delivered for water supply or clinics or schools. This is not something we've done a lot of work on. We started to try to look at this, but it's something that needs more work. Decommissioning is something that's very important and has to be considered. Many national databases just report how many plants have been built, and then they add them up year after year after year, and this is not particularly reliable in terms of reporting the number of plants that are still operating. I think a good example is India with its biogas plants, where India has basically installed about 5 million biogas plants since the 1980s, but many of those biogas plants built in the 1980s and the 1990s are no longer working. So the total number of biogas plants in operation is nowhere near 5 million. Many projects, many national sites are very good at reporting new capacity and capacity expansion, but much less is reported about previously installed capacity or existing plants and whether they are still operating or not. I think the biggest concern I have is that if off-grid keeps expanding at the rate it is at the moment, we're going to end up with a real lack of information in countries about this if countries do not start to think about how this could be collected nationally. We are doing it internationally. It's a fairly big exercise, but it would be much better if countries were to start to systematically collect this data themselves from non-traditional suppliers and operators, so that they have a better idea of what's going on, and then they can use that information themselves in their planning and their policies. I often say to colleagues here in IRENA, one of the biggest uses of renewables, in fact in many countries the largest use of renewables, is fuel wood, and most countries have very little idea of how much is being used. The problem we're going to have with a lot of this off-grid electricity production is it's going to become the second largest type of renewable being used in a country, and we're going to end up with the same situation that people are going to know it's very big but not know exactly how big, and I think that's going to be a problem that's going to increase in the future. I've come to the end of my presentation now. I hope you found it useful to understand how we've been collecting and processing this data here in IRENA, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.